What happened to the wives of the fallen angels after they were granted access to divine secrets remains a profound mystery. These women, according to some interpretations, became the mothers of generations corrupted by forbidden knowledge. This led to their legacy as the first witches recorded in history. However, their actions brought upon them a peculiar and severe punishment. The Book of Enoch, a significant text in ancient Jewish tradition that provides insights into the story of fallen angels, offers a fascinating claim about the wives of these celestial beings. It states that these women underwent a mysterious transformation, becoming creatures known as sirens. According to this interpretation, they were cursed to live as beings associated with the sea, weaving their haunting songs to enchant and lead sailors astray. Some believe that this transformation into sirens serves as the origin of the mermaid mythology found in various cultures. However, there is a significant challenge to this idea. The legend of sirens predates the widespread acceptance of the Book of Enoch and is rooted firmly in ancient Greek mythology, where sirens were never described as mermaids, but rather as bird-like creatures. The earliest Greek accounts of sirens, which can be traced back to around 300 BCE, describe them as having the heads of women and the bodies of birds. They resided on rocky islands in the sea and used their mesmerizing voices to lure sailors off course, ultimately causing their ships to crash against the jagged shores. These descriptions of sirens as bird-human hybrids raise doubts about their connection to the wives of fallen angels, as no similar bird-like features are attributed to these women in biblical or related texts. Therefore, while intriguing, the association between the sirens of Greek mythology and the wives of the fallen angels seems more like a later interpretative effort to merge distinct traditions rather than an original historical or theological link. In Greek mythology, sirens were enigmatic creatures that captivated the imagination of ancient storytellers. Unlike the popular image of mermaids, sirens were depicted as part bird, part woman, an embodiment of both beauty and danger. Early Greek art often portrayed them as birds with the heads of women, feathered bodies, and taloned feet. They were believed to inhabit remote islands, luring sailors to their doom with their hypnotic songs. These songs were said to be so enchanting that mariners would lose control of their ships, crashing onto the treacherous rocky shores where the sirens resided. As time passed, their depiction began to evolve. Later artistic renditions often showed them with more human-like features, sometimes as women with bird legs or wings, while still retaining their haunting voices. Their musical talents were emphasized as they were frequently shown playing instruments such as harps or lyres, further highlighting their ability to captivate through melody. The notion of sirens as bird women remained consistent in Greek mythology and art, making them distinct from the water-dwelling mermaids of later folklore. This contrast underscores the challenge of aligning the mythological sirens with the wives of fallen angels. The transformation into sirens described in the Book of Enoch implies a punishment tied to the sea, yet the sirens of Greek legend are firmly rooted in the air and land. This difference in symbolism and physical characteristics raises questions about whether the two narratives were ever meant to be connected, or if their association emerged from the blending of myths over time. Turning to the Bible, we find a foundational account in Genesis 6 verses 1-4, where the story of the sons of God and the daughters of men is introduced. This passage describes a time when humanity began to multiply on the earth, and daughters were born to them. The sons of God, interpreted by many as fallen angels, found these women beautiful and chose them as wives. From these unions, they bore children who were described as the Nephilim, giants and mighty beings of renown, often referred to as the heroes of old. These events marked a period of great moral and spiritual corruption, prompting divine concern. Observing humanity's increasing wickedness, God expressed sorrow for having created mankind and declared his intent to cleanse the earth of its depravity through a great flood. However, Noah, a man described as righteous and blameless in his generation, found favor with God. He was chosen to preserve life and ensure the continuity of humanity. This biblical narrative, while rich with theological significance, does not explicitly mention sirens, witches, or the specific fates of the fallen angels' wives. Instead, it focuses on the widespread moral decline resulting from these unions and the ensuing divine judgment. The absence of direct references to sirens or their bird-like qualities further complicates efforts to link them with the wives of the fallen angels, suggesting that later interpretations may have introduced this connection through creative theological and mythological synthesis. The connection between the wives of fallen angels and the sirens, as presented in mythological and religious discussions, has long puzzled scholars and enthusiasts. If the wives of these celestial beings were human, as the biblical account in Genesis 6 suggests, how did they become associated with sirens, or even the concept of witches? The transformation from mortal women into mythical or supernatural beings seems to stem from later interpretations, particularly those that sought to blend biblical narratives with pre-existing mythologies. During the time of Enoch and Noah, these women were described simply as the daughters of men, ordinary humans whose beauty captivated the sons of God. Yet, the notion of their transformation into sirens or witches might reflect an attempt to symbolically portray the consequences of their involvement with forbidden celestial beings. The sirens, known in Greek mythology for their mesmerizing voices and deadly allure, may have been used as a metaphor for the seductive danger associated with these unions. Over time, as early Christian theologians sought to reconcile pagan beliefs with biblical teachings, elements of these myths could have been adapted to align with biblical themes of sin, temptation, and divine punishment. This process of cultural and theological synthesis might explain how the wives of fallen angels came to be associated with sirens in later interpretations. However, a closer examination reveals that this link is tenuous at best, with little scriptural or historical evidence to directly connect these two distinct traditions. Instead, the association appears to be a product of evolving storytelling, shaped by the blending of religious doctrine and mythological imagination over centuries. To understand how myths about sirens may have been woven into early Christian beliefs, we must consider the historical context in which these ideas developed. By the 4th century, Christianity had become the dominant religious force, gradually replacing the pagan traditions that had once flourished across Europe and the Mediterranean. In this transitional period, many pagan myths and symbols were reinterpreted to align with Christian theology or were outright discouraged. Sirens, for instance, originally described in Greek mythology as bird-like creatures with enchanting voices, were repurposed as symbols of sin and worldly temptation. Early Christian writers, such as Clement of Alexandria and Ambrose of Milan, allegorized the sirens, portraying them as metaphors for the dangers of pleasure and indulgence. These interpretations reframed the sirens as cautionary figures rather than literal beings, warning against moral and spiritual decay. Over time, as Christianity continued to spread, these reinterpretations became widely accepted, further distancing the sirens from their Greek origins. Sirens were no longer seen as mythical beings luring sailors, but as representations of spiritual peril, temptations that could lead believers away from God. This shift in perception highlights how ancient mythologies were adapted to fit new religious frameworks. However, it also shows how myths, once allegorized, could be misinterpreted or linked to unrelated stories. The association of sirens with the wives of fallen angels likely stems from this blending of cultural narratives, as both tales explore themes of seduction, divine punishment, and moral consequence. Yet, despite their thematic overlaps, the connection remains speculative, illustrating the complexity of integrating diverse traditions into a unified worldview. The connection between the wives of fallen angels and the mythological sirens, despite some thematic similarities, appears to be largely speculative and unsupported by concrete evidence. The primary overlap lies in themes of temptation and the consequences of moral failings. Yet these connections seem more coincidental than intentional. The sirens, as described in Greek mythology, are deeply embedded in the cultural imagination of ancient Greece. They were portrayed as bird-like creatures, combining the heads and torsos of women with the wings, feathers, and talons of birds. Their defining characteristic was their enchanting song, which lured sailors to their doom, symbolizing the dangers of irresistible allure and the consequences of succumbing to temptation. In contrast, the biblical narrative concerning the wives of fallen angels lacks any description that aligns with the bird-like or hybrid features of the sirens. Instead, these women are portrayed as entirely human, their story grounded in a moral and spiritual framework rather than mythological symbolism. The suggestion that they transformed into sirens, or even into sea-dwelling beings like mermaids, seems to be a later interpretative addition rather than a direct part of the original texts. This divergence underscores the distinct cultural and theological origins of these two traditions. While both explore the consequences of forbidden relationships and the allure of the forbidden, their depictions and context remain fundamentally different, highlighting the tenuous nature of any proposed connection between them. The evolution of sirens from bird-like creatures to the mermaid-like beings often depicted in medieval bestiaries demonstrates the fluid and dynamic nature of mythological interpretation over time. Early Greek descriptions of sirens emphasize their avian characteristics, portraying them as creatures with the wings, feathers, and talons of birds, combined with the heads and torsos of women. This imagery symbolized their liminal nature, caught between the heavens and the earth, embodying both beauty and danger. However, as centuries passed and cultural influences shifted, the representation of sirens began to change. By the Middle Ages, the influence of maritime traditions and the growing fascination with oceanic lore led to the gradual incorporation of aquatic elements into their imagery. Instead of bird-like features, sirens began to be depicted with fish tails, blending their allure with the mystery of the sea. This transformation aligned them more closely with mermaids, a distinct yet equally fascinating mythical figure. The inclusion of fishtails in illustrations, particularly in European bestiaries, reflects a significant adaptation influenced by artistic trends, regional folklore, and evolving symbolic needs. These bestiaries, which served as medieval compendiums of real and mythical creatures, often combine descriptions and depictions of beings from different traditions, creating hybrids that bore little resemblance to their original forms. The blending of sirens and mermaids also reflects the broader tendency of medieval storytellers and theologians to reinterpret ancient myths within the framework of Christian thought. The sirens' shift from bird women to fish women might have been influenced by their symbolic association with temptation and sin, traits that made them fitting allegories for moral cautionary tales. Yet, this transformation underscores a critical point. The siren's evolving image was driven by cultural adaptation rather than any direct connection to biblical narratives or the story of fallen angels. The artistic and literary reinterpretations that reshaped their identity were products of a time when myths were fluid, adapting to meet the artistic, religious, and societal needs of the moment. This fluidity highlights the challenges of tracing mythological figures to a singular origin or linking them conclusively to unrelated traditions, such as the wives of the fallen angels. In conclusion, while the tales of fallen angels' wives and the mythology of sirens share certain thematic overlaps, such as seduction, temptation, and the consequences of transgressing divine boundaries, their origins and meanings are fundamentally distinct. The wives of fallen angels, as described in Genesis and related apocryphal texts like the Book of Enoch, were human women whose unions with divine beings brought forth the Nephilim, leading to moral corruption and ultimately divine judgment. This narrative is deeply rooted in a spiritual and theological context, addressing themes of sin, divine justice, and the boundaries between the earthly and the celestial. In contrast, sirens belong to the realm of Greek mythology, where they served as cautionary figures warning of the perils of desire and unchecked ambition. Their bird-like features, haunting songs, and later aquatic transformations reflect a symbolic exploration of humanity's struggles with temptation and the consequences of yielding to it. Any attempt to draw a direct connection between these two narratives likely arises from later interpretative efforts that sought to merge disparate traditions. Such efforts may have been driven by the blending of mythologies during the spread of Christianity, as theologians and scholars sought to reinterpret pagan stories through a Christian lens. However, these connections are speculative at best and lack substantial historical or textual evidence. Instead, they illustrate how myths evolve, intersect, and are reimagined over time, influenced by cultural exchanges and shifting symbolic frameworks. The story of the fallen angels' wives remains a profound exploration of divine-human interaction, while the sirens endure as enduring symbols of temptation and its perilous consequences. Together, they offer rich narratives that continue to fascinate, even as their connections remain tenuous and primarily the product of later mythological and theological synthesis. Thank you for engaging with these complex and intriguing traditions.